Hello everyone, I'm so pleased to be asked to be joining you. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to be there with you in Brazil. I bring you very warm greetings of welcome and enthusiastic good wishes from all of us in Scotland to you in FISE and at the conference in Brazil. And we wish you well, and I'm grateful to have a chance to speak with you today. I've been asked to speak with you about how we understand the UN guidelines in the context of what we've learned in the last 9 years of their life. So the UN guidelines for alternative care were welcomed by the UN General Assembly in 2009, and we have now seen 9 years of their implementation globally. And I'd like to share with you some of the learning that we've had, really a quick overview of what we know about what are the guidelines, how we can support governments to ensure that those guidelines are actually happening on the ground, reflect with you a little about the progress on implementation and what some of the gaps and the next steps might be for us globally. And I think this gives you an opportunity to think together about what's most relevant for you in Brazil, in where you've accomplished a great deal, and what continues to need to be done for children and young people to ensure that their rights are realized and they have the best possible opportunities to thrive. So let's launch in then. Children without parental care around the world. We know that this is a global issue. So children who are unable to live with their parents, this is the reality in every country, low, middle, and high income countries, and whether they're stable or they're fragile countries. But there are differences regionally between why children are coming into the out of care context. Why are they coming into institutions in many parts of the world? Why are they coming into other kinds of care settings? There's an estimate of about 151 million children worldwide who are living outside of parental care. That's from UNICEF in 2013. But the reality is we don't really have reliable data in most countries. And so we're concerned really about children who we aren't counting, because in many ways they are lost in the care system. And it's really important that we are able to know where children are, especially children for whom we have responsibility. So many children around the world are unnecessarily without their parental care. So it might be because of experiences of social exclusion, of their own experiences or their family's experiences. Stigma and discrimination has a big part to play. There's a real lack of community-based family support for families. So some of the different pieces that play into why children may not be living with their parents might be poverty, the lack of social security benefits, the lack of health services, the lack of inclusive education, especially for children with disabilities. Now, poverty may not be the primary reason why children aren't living with their families, but we really recognize globally that this is an underlying causality. And while we often talk about institutions as being orphanages, we know that these are not orphans. These are not children without parents. Over 90% of children who are in care have at least one living parent. And so we often refer to these instead as social orphans. There are very different reasons why in Western Europe, as opposed to, say, Central and Eastern Europe, as to why children are coming into the care system, as I'll call it. In Western Europe, it's predominantly because of parental abuse and neglect of children, and then to a lesser extent social reasons. Whereas in Central and Eastern Europe, we know that there are social reasons as the primary reason that children are coming into care and aren't living with their parents. And the secondary reason would be mainly disability. So for Brazil, you'll know for yourselves, really a fundamental question is, why are children not living with their parents? And what can be done to reduce the necessity of that? Let's turn to think about the UN guidelines themselves and what they have to say. So if you're not familiar with the UN guidelines, and I would imagine at this point you will be, but just a fundamental sort of review of it is that we're understanding the UN guidelines for alternative care for children is intended to help address the preventing family separation in the first place. We want to promote family reintegration. And we also then want to promote family-type alternative care for children when they can't live with their parents. And there's a handbook on the guidelines called Moving Forward that you may be interested in accessing, that can be available online. And the website is alternativecareguidelines.org. So let's take a look just at the content of the guidelines for a short time. The guidelines are driven by two principles. One is the necessity principle, and the other is the suitability principle. And upholding the necessity principle is really looking at why are those children coming into the care system? What can be done to prevent parents needing to relinquish their parental responsibilities? And what could be done to ensure that parents can, and if not parents, then their close family, what can be done to support children being cared for within their families themselves? And the necessity principle would tell us that it's really important we do all we can to ensure children can stay with their families before any need to come and be living with other families or in other places. The other part of the necessity principle tells us that there has to be a really credible gatekeeping mechanism. So there needs to be decision making about why a child is having to come into the system, and in order to ensure that there aren't any incentives that are driving children to be placed in, for example, institutions where there might be financial drivers in a system that enables that encourages parents to be placing their children where there's a pull for those parents because of, for example, foreign donors. So we need to make sure there's a clear decision-making process before children are then taken away from their families. The second principle is the suitability principle, and this is really saying two things. One is that in order for the care for that child to be suitable, we need to make sure we understand the individual needs of each child, and we match the needs of that child to what the care setting can provide them. And so, of course, in order to do that, we need to have standards for the care settings. We need to have a range of options so that we can match the child's needs to the kind of care that might be available. And the suitability principle is a really critical piece that takes a great deal of work, and that I think FISE is very central in its delivery of, and other international organizations are also very central in achieving. So what do we need to do to achieve these principles? So one of the key pieces I'd like to bring to you today is the idea of the importance of recognizing that an alternative care system is integral to a well-functioning child protection system. So if we're protecting children, we must understand how that links with a wider alternative care system. And governments, of course, play a significant role in achieving that. So let me run through some ways in which we understand these pieces working together. So the first is, if an alternative care system is going to be closely connected with a national child protection system, it means that there is an intersectoral approach and a holistic approach to understanding how we care for children. A whole system and all the pieces of those systems need to come together. I was speaking before about a gatekeeping mechanism, and so we need to really make sure that gatekeeping that helps us to think about why children are coming into care, and if they need to come into care, they need to be, the decision-making processes need to hold both the necessity principle and the suitability principle both in balance. The third thing we need, as well as an integrated system and good gatekeeping, is an appropriate legal and regulatory framework. So how are we understanding what the laws and the policies are saying? Do they mandate the roles and responsibilities that are needed? Do we have the range of care options that are needed? And are we ensuring that large-scale institutions are increasingly being reduced in favor of smaller family-like and family-based care for children? Because we know for children's outcomes, these are really important kinds of care settings, the family-based, family-like models that allow us to really attend to the individual needs and build positive relationships with children as part of an integrated community and not isolated from the community. We also need, of course, resources to be helping us do this, and resources are both in terms of the financial but also the human resources. So how do we understand the workforce and what their needs are? So many people are working with children, of course, And so what is it that they need to know, and what is it that they need to be doing, and how are we selecting those staff to ensure they're the best possible people to be caring and really loving children, to raise them to be able to thrive? These are very important questions for us globally. There's also a whole number of sort of tools that are a part of a system that works for children. Ways in which we might refer children from one body or system to another body or a system, and the way in which we're making assessments and determining whether a child can live with their family or not are important ways of understanding how well our gatekeeping systems are working. So also, of course, there's standards for and guidance around how case management is being taken forward, if it's called that. So how are we understanding the oversight of a child's needs and the process as they go between perhaps different kinds of services, and also how are we ensuring monitoring is in place that is a genuine monitoring of how well these services are meeting children's needs. Again, part of how we're ensuring governments are supporting, how we're supporting governments to deliver the UN guidelines effectively means that we need to have a continuum of services, a whole range of different services for children. And we need to make sure that we're somehow keeping track with some sort of data system, an information management system that tells us, are we actually meeting children's needs well? There are social norms and practices and attitudes that also play a significant role in whether or not children are coming into care. The place of stigma and discrimination can play a significant role in why children are coming into care. We need to understand from a bigger picture perspective how that plays into why children are coming into care, and ensure that culturally we're addressing some of these mindsets and helping to change mindsets. And the last piece I'd like to share in terms of the government, how we support government's role, is thinking about how do we generate and affirm the political will that's needed to keep a steady gaze on the needs of children and keep a clear momentum going forward with a focus on the things that need to change, because care reform is a long game. It's a long-term process that needs an ongoing commitment from governments and ministers. And without this, we won't get where we need to get to for children. So where are we getting to in 9 years? What do we think we've done with implementation of the UN guidelines? Well, we've had this international framework of the Convention on the Rights of the Child feeding into UN guidelines. These have really effectively been accommodated into national laws and policies. In 2017, there were 73 countries out of 158 who reported to the Better Care Network that the country had alternative care policies that were in line with the guidelines. So we're doing well in terms of our laws and policies. There are many countries who are taking forward care reforms and activating deinstitutionalization processes. And there are broader partnerships between governments and international and national non-governmental organizations, local organizations in partnership with others, as well as donors, foreign donors for reforms. And there's a great deal more buy-in and willingness to engage with the issues related to deinstitutionalization, for example, from a whole range of faith actors like the evangelical churches, Catholic churches and charities, as well as Islamic organizations. And this is an important moment, I think, that we need to really recognize all of these different players and the roles they play and the willingness they're demonstrating. In some countries, there has been a significant reduction in the numbers of children in institutional care, and the numbers of institutions in a few countries have gone down. But we are still really genuinely concerned globally about the numbers of countries that are increasing their building and usage of institutions as the single offer for children who can't live with their families. We know these are very poor decisions for children, and this is a very difficult place for children to grow up. For a whole number of reasons, and so we continue to be quite concerned about the lack of progress ultimately in reducing the numbers of institutions and reducing the numbers of children who are living in institutions around the world. We have learned a lot in a number of different regions of the world about how we support reintegration of children back into their families who are in institutions, and these are some really good news stories. There are some promising practices and promising examples of how changing institutions has and moving institutional care into more family-based, community-based care settings have been really successful. And indeed, even the support for domestic adoption has been taken up in a number of countries over the last 10 years. We recognize there's been a real need to be testing of the interventions that are being used. So while we might be saying family-based care has been a useful alternative, of course, to institutions, we also want to understand whether they're being implemented in a way that supports the families that are caring for those children, and whether there's a transparency to ensure that children are safe in those environments. And so while we might be seeing family-based care as a really critical option for children who can't live with their own families, they might live in foster families, we also need to keep a very clear focus on ensuring the systems are in place to support safe and effective and caring families caring for those children. We can't make assumptions that they will be caring simply because family-based care is being provided. There are some great examples of gatekeeping in a whole range of diverse contexts where there's very few resources. Small committees still come together to make decisions, and these committees are independent from the care providers themselves, which is a really important feature. There's been an increased focus on the workforce. Certainly UNICEF's strategic plan globally is focused on the workforce specifically, amongst other areas, and this is a new development that we really welcome because the training and skills of those who are working with children is critical. We also recognize there's been a role of donors that has been both positive and negative, but we're understanding better the way in which positive donations by foreign donors into the care system can support community-based care and reduce their institutions' reliance on external donors. And that will help us to ensure we are better caring for children's needs in those communities. So what are the gaps that we still see? We see, so I've said there's been a good policy framework in a great number of countries, but the implementation itself has been limited of those policies and laws. The approaches have been piecemeal. They've not been supported by a full redirection of resources and the local change mechanisms that are being used, sort of pilots, use of different efforts are not actually being scaled up in a way that can be consistent, and so then they aren't necessarily reaching all children's needs. Where we see concerns also are that where care reforms are not actually part of the child protection system, so that these two are seen quite separately. And until we see these as two parts of the same whole, we won't really be getting it right for children. There are some really major drivers as to why children are being taken into large-scale institutions around the world, where those still exist. And sometimes this is about access to education, access to health, and family income. And these are drivers that aren't being holistically taken and addressed in countries. And with that gap, our concern is that we won't really realize the necessity principle effectively, and that we really need to turn our attention to some of these fundamental community-based services that are needed in order to stop children needing to come into alternative care. On the particular focus of deinstitutionalization, what we're seeing is, again, a gap in that we are looking much too closely at closing down institutions and not enough of deinstitutionalizing the whole system. So it's not about just closing down an institution, it's about understanding the prevention that is needed, the community-based supports that is needed, and the gatekeeping that's needed long before we begin to think about the kind of institutions. We, of course, need to close down large-scale institutions, but we aren't necessarily seeing the whole system being changed. So, for example, we might be seeing reduced numbers of children in residential care in Eastern Europe, for example, but that doesn't necessarily translate into reductions of the numbers of children going into the care system. Whereas if we focused on earlier interventions and preventions, we'd like to see fewer children needing to be separated in the first place. And around the world, the use of large-scale residential facilities seems to still be the most dominant form of placement, where children, in particular with disabilities, are not a priority to be placed in families, and that around the world, children under 3 are still being institutionalized, which we know can be terribly harmful for their long-term outcomes. There are a few things that are really out of sight from us, and as I just close with these two last thoughts, the first is the things that are out of sight are the ways in which the regulatory systems overseeing these the care systems often are very weak. There's a lack of investment in the data and information systems, both sort of statistical data as well as administrative data, and even information at the practice level. We're not investing enough to be able to make the right decisions for children. And I've mentioned children with disabilities are left out, but sometimes the arguments are that it's just too hard to care for these children in families, or it's not, just aren't enough resources. But we need to understand that the Agenda 2030 of the Sustainability Development Goals is primarily focused on leaving no child behind. And so if that's the case, then we need to be ensuring that those who are most likely to be left behind become increasingly our first priority. There are major trends, of course, globally affecting children's care, including migration and refugee children and their families, and that is increasingly a concern for us, particularly in relation to their families' ability to care for them. So what are the next steps? How do we move that agenda forward? Well, I think I want to pull together just some pieces from our global research and our activities at CELCIS that are both Scotland-based as well as international. How we move this agenda forward now, as we're coming up to the 10th anniversary of the UN guidelines, we would suggest the following things. We need to be focusing on families first, including support for the extended family and kinship care, and that will be central for going forward. We need to be preventing separation and seeing the whole system being one system, and so that our prevention is directly affecting whether or not children's outcomes, whether children are coming into the care system, and ultimately what their outcomes become. I want to underline again the idea of focusing on all children, particularly those who are most likely to be left behind. The importance of the state obligations to having regulatory systems in place, that we redirect our resources away from and including private donations away from orphanage businesses or institution businesses. We want to be focusing on data and evidence, monitoring impact, culture and behavior change, and ultimately understanding workforce reform as we educate and support the skills and development of the skills of people who are working directly with children. So I've been asked to give you a picture of what we're seeing from CELCIS in our global work in relation to alternative care, alongside many, many other people who are working so hard with children and for children to ensure that their experiences are better than they have been when they're not able to live with their families. And I hope this has been a useful, quick run-through of all of the headline dominant themes that we've been seeing. And I wish you well for the rest of your conference. Thank you again for asking me to speak.